Emily was just 2 years old when her life took a turn she would never understand until much later. At that age, the world is still a blur of sounds, colors, and faces. But for Emily, silence became the loudest part of her life. She was adopted by Mark and Linda, a couple who had long dreamed of becoming parents. When Emily entered their lives, it was as if a missing piece had finally been found. Mark was an electrician, his hands often rough from long hours of work, but always gentle when he held Emily. Linda was a teacher, the kind of woman who carried patience like second nature and could turn even the most ordinary day into a lesson worth remembering. Their home in a quiet Midwestern town seemed like the perfect place for a little girl to grow up. The garden bloomed with roses, the kitchen smelled of Linda's cookies, and on summer nights fireflies danced across the yard. To outsiders, Emily's childhood looked picture perfect. She was cared for, loved, and safe. But there was an unspoken rule in the household. The past was not to be discussed. The first time Emily dared to ask about where she had come from, she was 6 years old. She had been coloring at the kitchen table, the crayons scattered in front of her, when she suddenly looked up and asked softly, "Mom, did I have another mommy before you?" The question froze the air. Linda's hand, which had been stirring a pot on the stove, stopped mid-motion. Mark, sitting nearby reading the newspaper, lowered it slowly but said nothing. After a few moments of heavy silence, Linda forced a smile and replied, "You're our daughter, Emily, that's all that matters." Emily understood. Some doors were not meant to be opened. From that day on, she kept her questions locked away, deep inside, where no one could see them. But silence, though protective, has a way of shaping a person. Emily grew into a thoughtful, observant child who spoke less than most of her peers. She listened carefully, noticing details that others missed. The way Linda's eyes sometimes grew distant when adoption was mentioned on television, or how Mark quickly changed the channel when conversations touched on families and abandonment. She learned to smile, to nod, to fit in, while never voicing the ache she carried in her heart. On birthdays, when candles flickered before her, she never wished for toys or adventures. Year after year, she closed her eyes and whispered the same wish only to herself. "I just want to know who I am." Despite her quiet nature, Emily wasn't unhappy. She loved playing with friends at the park, riding her bike down the street, and waiting by the window each evening for Mark to come home. There was love in that household. Real, undeniable love. Yet even love couldn't erase the invisible thread that connected her to a story she didn't know. Her silence became both her shield and her prison. Teachers praised her discipline, her ability to focus for long hours. Friends admired her loyalty. Adults complimented her politeness. But behind the calm eyes of this little girl, a storm brewed, one that no one else could see. And though she promised herself never to disrupt the balance of the family that had saved her, destiny had other plans. Because silence, no matter how strong, cannot hold back the truth forever. What Emily didn't know was that the first cracks in her carefully built wall would appear during her teenage years. A new chapter of her life was waiting, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and her past. But before we move forward, let me ask you, if you had grown up with unanswered questions about your origins, would you have stayed silent like Emily? Or would you have demanded the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because Emily's story is just beginning, and the next chapter will break the silence in ways you won't expect. Adolescence is a storm for most teenagers, but for Emily it was a storm within a storm. By the time she turned 13, the quiet little girl had become a thoughtful young woman, carrying secrets she didn't fully understand. At school, she wasn't unpopular, but she wasn't quite like everyone else either. Her classmates sometimes teased her for being too quiet, for always sitting at the back of the class and scribbling in her notebook instead of chatting loudly during breaks. Some days the teasing was gentle, almost playful, but other days it cut deep. "Why don't you ever talk? Are you mute or something?" One boy sneered once in the cafeteria. Emily laughed it off, but inside she felt the sting. She wanted to shout, to explain that her silence wasn't emptiness but protection. Yet the words always stayed trapped inside. Still, high school had its brighter moments. She excelled in literature classes, where teachers praised her essays for their depth and sensitivity. Books became her refuge. Through stories of heroes, misfits, and wanderers, she found echoes of herself. One line from a novel stayed with her for years. "Some truths are too loud to remain buried." Emily underlined it, reading it over and over, as if it had been written for her alone. It was around this time that she began noticing small hints of her past, clues that slipped through the cracks despite her parents' silence. One afternoon, while searching for extra paper in the attic, Emily stumbled upon an old cardboard box sealed with tape. Written on the side, in Linda's handwriting, were the words, "Emily, early years." Her heart raced as she pulled it toward her, hands trembling. Inside, she found baby clothes, a pair of tiny shoes, and a faded photograph of herself as a toddler, sitting on the steps of a building she didn't recognize. But before she could examine it further, Linda's voice echoed from downstairs. "Emily, dinner's ready." Startled, Emily quickly shoved the photo back into the box and sealed it shut. That night at the dinner table, she looked at Linda differently, wondering what stories her adoptive mother had chosen to keep hidden. As the years passed, Emily's questions grew louder in her mind, though her lips stayed sealed. At 15, she started keeping a journal, filling it with the words she never dared to say out loud. Who was my first mother? Did she love me? Did she even want me? Sometimes she wrote angry entries, other times heartbreaking ones, but always with the same conclusion. She needed to know the truth. Her relationship with Mark and Linda grew more complicated during these years. They still loved her fiercely, but the distance created by their silence was becoming harder to ignore. When Emily was 16, she tried once more to bring it up. Sitting across from her parents at breakfast, she gathered her courage and asked, "Do you know anything about my real parents?" Mark looked at her with kind but weary eyes. "Emily," he said softly, "you're our daughter. That's what's real." Linda reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly, but her trembling fingers revealed the fear behind her smile. Emily didn't push further. She swallowed her questions again, the way she always had. But in her heart she knew that one day, silence wouldn't be enough. The more she tried to bury her curiosity, the more it rose to the surface. And with each passing year, the weight of her unanswered questions grew heavier, pressing down on her like a shadow that followed her everywhere. She didn't know it yet, but the silence that had defined her childhood and teenage years was slowly preparing her for the day when everything would change. Because soon Emily would step into adulthood, believing she had finally found stability, only for her past to come crashing back in the form of a single devastating letter. But before we get there, let me ask you something. If you were in Emily's place, would you have opened that box in the attic and confronted your parents? Or would you have done what she did and stayed quiet? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you're still with me. Emily's journey is only getting more intense. By the time Emily reached her mid-20s, she had become the kind of person others admired for her composure. She had turned silence into strength, discipline, and focus. After graduating from college with a degree in social work, she dedicated herself to helping children who had faced difficult beginnings, much like her own. Friends often described her as empathetic, someone who could listen without judgment and understand what was left unsaid. On the surface, Emily's life seemed steady, even enviable. She had a small apartment in the city, decorated with thrift store finds and secondhand books. She worked at a local community center, mentoring teenagers who struggled with family issues. And she was in a relationship with Daniel, a kind and ambitious young man studying to become a lawyer. Daniel adored her quiet strength, though sometimes he wished she would open up more about her own past. But Emily had learned to keep that part of herself carefully locked away. The girl who had grown up in silence had built a woman who lived in silence too, outwardly happy, inwardly guarded. Every now and then, the questions resurfaced, especially when she saw the kids at the center grappling with abandonment. When a 14-year-old named Sarah confided, "I just want to know why my parents left me," Emily felt a jolt deep in her chest. The words echoed her own hidden thoughts, but she smiled gently and replied, "Sometimes the answers don't come easily, but what matters is the people who choose to stay." It was the same answer she had been giving herself for years. And then came the letter. It arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, tucked among the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Emily almost didn't notice it at first. The envelope was plain, addressed in a shaky handwriting she didn't recognize. Her full name, Emily Grace Johnson, was written in blue ink. The return address was smudged, barely legible, but one word stood out. Anderson. Emily's heart stopped. Anderson. That was the surname she had seen once, years ago, on an old hospital form accidentally left inside her baby book. A name she had carried silently in the corners of her mind, never daring to ask about. Her hands trembled as she tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter, folded neatly, the paper slightly yellowed. At the top, in uncertain handwriting, were the words, "To my daughter Emily." She read it once, twice, 3 times, unable to breathe. The man who wrote the letter claimed to be her biological father. He explained in fragmented sentences that he had been forced to give her up, that there were circumstances beyond his control, and that her mother, her first mother, had made choices Emily had never been told about. He begged for forgiveness, admitted his mistakes, and said he wanted the chance to meet her before it was too late. Each line pierced through the silence Emily had carried for so long. Every word felt like both a gift and a wound. She sat on the couch, the letter trembling in her hands, tears spilling down her face. Daniel, who had just come home, froze when he saw her like that. "Emily, what happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She handed him the letter wordlessly, her throat too tight to speak. He read it quickly, his eyes widening. "Oh my God, this changes everything." And it did. The silence of her childhood, the unanswered questions, the hidden clues, all of it had led to this moment. Now the past wasn't just a shadow in the background. It was knocking on her door, demanding to be faced. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of Mark and Linda, who had given her everything. She thought of the attic box, the unanswered questions, the trembling hand of her mother when she once asked about her origins. And she thought of the man who had written those words, "I am your father." Could she forgive him? Should she meet him? Would knowing the truth heal her or destroy the fragile stability she had built? Emily didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. Silence was no longer an option. And what came next would test her heart more than anything she had ever faced. But let me ask you, if you were Emily, would you open the door to a man who had abandoned you? Or would you choose to protect the family who raised you by keeping the past buried? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe, because Emily's next decision will change everything. The letter sat on Emily's nightstand for days, as if it were alive, whispering to her each time she passed by. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in work at the community center, spending extra hours with Daniel and calling Linda more often than usual. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the letter was always there, a silent reminder that the past had found her. At first, she considered hiding it forever. She even thought about shredding it, letting the pieces fall into the trash and vanish. But every time she picked it up, her hands refused to move. Something inside her, perhaps the same part of her that had made wishes over birthday candles, wouldn't let her throw it away. Finally, after nearly a week of sleepless nights, Emily made a decision. She would write back. Her message was short, almost mechanical. "I received your letter. If what you say is true, we should talk. But I need answers. Meet me in person." She didn't expect a quick reply. But only 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Her biological father had agreed. He suggested meeting at a small diner 2 towns away, a place discreet enough that neither of them would feel exposed. The night before the meeting, Emily called Linda. She didn't mention the letter, only asked, "Mom, did you ever wonder about my real parents?" There was a pause, then Linda's soft reply, "Not anymore. You're the only daughter I ever needed." The words were loving, but they carried a shadow. Linda was holding back, just as she always had. Emily cried after hanging up, guilt gnawing at her heart. She loved Mark and Linda deeply, but now she was about to step into a world they had fought to keep her away from. The next day, Emily drove to the diner. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, her stomach in knots. When she pulled into the parking lot, she saw him immediately. A man in his late 50s sat at a corner table by the window. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hair graying, his eyes tired but alert. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment their eyes locked. Emily froze. It was like looking at a reflection of herself, only older, worn by years she hadn't lived. "Emily." His voice cracked as he stood, his hands trembling. She nodded slowly, her throat dry. "Yes." They sat across from each other, a gulf of years and secrets between them. For a long while, neither spoke. The waitress came by, refilled their waters, and left, sensing the tension in the air. Finally, he spoke. "I've waited so many years for this." Emily folded her arms tightly. "Why? Why now?" He looked down at his hands. "Because I didn't have the courage before. And because I'm sick." His voice faltered. "I don't know how much time I have left. I couldn't leave this world without trying to explain." Her chest tightened. 1,000 questions fought to escape her lips, but only one came out. "Why did you leave me?" Tears filled his eyes. "It wasn't my choice. Your mother. She made the decision. I fought, Emily, but I lost. And then I was weak. I didn't fight hard enough." Emily's hands shook. Part of her wanted to scream, to accuse him of lying. Another part wanted to believe him, to reach across the table and close the gap of decades. For 2 hours they talked. He told her pieces of the story, how he had been young, scared, how family pressures and financial ruin had pushed him into silence. Some of it sounded like excuses. Some of it sounded heartbreakingly real. When Emily finally left the diner, her head was spinning. She didn't know whether to feel relief or betrayal, forgiveness or fury. All she knew was that the silence of her childhood had been shattered completely. Driving home, she realized something. Meeting her father had not given her closure. It had only opened more doors, ones she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. But what if behind those doors lay the final piece of her identity she had been searching for her whole life? And so Emily had to decide. Would she return to the life she had built, protecting her adoptive parents and keeping the past buried? Or would she chase the truth no matter how painful it might be? In the weeks that followed her meeting with her biological father, Emily's life felt like a fragile balancing act. She went through her days as if nothing had changed, mentoring teenagers at the community center, cooking dinners with Daniel, calling Linda every Sunday. But beneath the surface, everything was different. The silence that had once defined her world was gone, replaced by a constant storm of voices in her head. Her father's words echoed relentlessly. "I didn't fight hard enough. I was weak." She couldn't decide whether those words were an excuse or a confession. Daniel noticed her struggle. One evening, he sat her down, his eyes steady. "Emily, you don't have to carry this alone. You've spent your whole life in silence. Maybe it's time to let people in." His words lingered. That night, Emily made a decision she had avoided her whole life. She would tell Mark and Linda about the letter. The next day, she drove back to her childhood home. The familiar creak of the front steps, the smell of Linda's cooking drifting from the kitchen, Mark's favorite chair still by the window. It was as if nothing had changed, but everything had. They sat together in the living room, the letter in Emily's trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she said, "I need to tell you something." She handed them the envelope, and for the first time in years, silence in that house felt heavy again. Linda read it first, her face tightening with every word. Mark leaned forward, his jaw set, eyes dark. When Linda finally lowered the letter, tears glistened on her cheeks. "I always knew this day would come," she whispered. "I just prayed it wouldn't." Emily's voice broke. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep everything a secret?" Mark spoke then, his voice low but firm. "Because we wanted to protect you. You were so little, Emily, so fragile, and we were terrified that if you knew too much, you'd slip away from us." "But I was already slipping away," Emily replied, her tears falling freely. "I spent my whole life wondering. Do you know what that feels like?" The room fell quiet. For the first time, the silence wasn't avoidance. It was understanding. Linda reached across the table, taking Emily's hand. "We may not have given you the answers, but we gave you love. and we never stopped. At that moment, Emily realized something profound. Love hadn't been missing from her life. It had always been there, quietly, faithfully, in the form of Mark and Linda. But love alone couldn't erase the scars of secrecy. She needed the truth, no matter how painful, to truly heal. Over the following months, Emily met with her biological father a few more times. Some conversations were raw, filled with anger. Others were unexpectedly tender. She never fully forgave him, but she came to understand him. He was not the monster she had once imagined, nor the hero she sometimes wished for. He was simply a flawed man who had made choices that changed both their lives forever. The day he passed away, Emily felt a strange peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because she had faced the truth head-on. Silence no longer controlled her. In the end, Emily chose to live fully in the family that had raised her. She honored Mark and Linda for the love that had carried her through the years. But she also carried with her the lessons of her past. That identity is not only built from where we come from, but also from where we choose to belong. Her story became one she shared openly with the teenagers at the center. She told them, "Family is not always about blood. Family is about who stays, who fights for you, and who loves you without conditions." And in those words, she finally found her voice. So what about you? Do you believe family is defined by biology or by love? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if Emily's journey moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Stories like hers remind us that the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free.